The fluorescent lights of Chicago General hummed a low, sterile frequency, casting long, hollow shadows across the linoleum floor. Tuesday, 2:14 a.m. The rhythmic hiss and click of the ventilator served as a cruel metronome, marking the exact pace of a childhood slipping away. Beyond the frost-choked window, the city was a sprawling grid of indifferent amber streetlights buried under a fresh layer of February ice. Arthur Brooks sat perfectly still in the plastic chair beside the hospital bed, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles shone white beneath his dark skin. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic, bleached cotton, and the faint metallic tang of institutional coffee. In the bed, submerged beneath a tangle of transparent tubes in a faded blue blanket, 6-year-old Thomas looked terrifyingly small. The boy's chest rose and fell with a shallow, mechanical shudder. Doctor Evans stood at the foot of the bed, a clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield. The physician's eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses, carried the heavy, practiced exhaustion of a man used to delivering nightmares in the dead of night. The structural integrity of the mitral valve is deteriorating faster than the previous scans indicated. The doctor's voice was a quiet, clinical murmur, designed to contain panic rather than alleviate it. The patching procedure is no longer viable. He needs a full mechanical replacement. The window is closing, Arthur. Arthur didn't blink. His gaze remained locked on the steady, jagged green line of the heart monitor. How long? Dr. Evans shifted his weight, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. 8 weeks, 10 at the absolute outside. After that, the heart muscle will sustain irreversible ischemic damage. Total failure becomes inevitable. The words hung in the frigid air, heavy and absolute. 8 weeks, 56 days. A countdown to the end of the only world Arthur had left. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs, feeling the worn fabric of his work trousers pull tight against his knees. The surgical cue. Arthur's voice was a low, resonant baritone, scraped raw by 3 consecutive sleepless nights. Put him on the priority schedule. I'll sign whatever promissory notes the billing department requires. It's not just a matter of scheduling. Dr. Evans lowered the clipboard, his expression softening into something uncomfortably close to pity. A full mechanical replacement of this complexity, factoring in the specialized pediatric cardiothoracic team, the post-operative intensive care, the custom synthetic grafts. The administration requires a minimum deposit of $140,000 before they will authorize the operating theater. Your current insurance plan categorized this specific hardware as experimental. They denied the pre-authorization. $140,000. The number did not compute as currency. It was a phantom, an impossible mountain of paper and digits, completely untethered from the reality of a man whose checking account currently held exactly $47.12. Arthur stood up. He was a tall man, 6'2", with the lean, corded muscle of someone who traded physical labor for survival. He walked to the edge of the bed and gently rested his large, calloused hand over his son's frail, sleeping fingers. He thought of Maya. 3 years ago, in a room just down this very hall, he had held his wife's hand as ovarian cancer finally stripped the last breath from her lungs. He had promised her, leaning down to whisper against her fever-dampened forehead, that the boy would be safe, that he would build a fortress around Thomas. I will have the funds. Arthur did not look at the doctor. He kept his eyes on the slow flutter of his son's eyelashes. Set the date for 7 weeks from today. The money will be in the hospital's escrow account. Arthur, please understand the reality of this. Dr. Evans stepped closer, lowering his voice further. There are charitable trusts, state-funded avenues we can explore. Though the wait lists are years long, you work 2 blue-collar jobs. The administration will not hold a surgical block on a promise. Arthur turned, his dark eyes locking onto the physician with a calm, terrifying, absolute certainty. A man's word is the only currency that doesn't depreciate. Schedule the surgery. I will not let my son die in this room. Dr. Evans held the gaze for a long moment, then slowly nodded, making a sharp notation on his chart. 7 weeks. I'll prep the preliminary paperwork, but Arthur, if the deposit isn't cleared 48 hours prior, the board will cancel it. I can't override them. The door clicked shut. Arthur was alone with the rhythmic hiss of the machine. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of thick drawing paper. He smoothed it out against the metal bed rail. It was a sketch Thomas had made 2 days ago, rendered in heavy strokes of blue and black crayon. A towering man with wide shoulders holding an umbrella over a smaller stick figure, shielding it from a storm of jagged scribbles. Thomas stirred, a tiny cough rattling deep in his chest. His eyelids fluttered open, dark brown and heavy with residual sedatives. The boy's lips were tinted a faint, alarming shade of blue. "Hey, buddy." Arthur quickly folded the paper away, forcing a warm, steady smile onto his face. He brushed a damp curl of hair from the boy's forehead. "You're awake. The machines are doing their job." Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "It hurts to breathe, Dad. Feels like rocks." "I know, Tommy. The rocks are just heavy right now, but we're going to get them out. The doctors have a plan." Arthur poured a tiny measure of water into a plastic cup, guiding the ridged straw to his son's lips. "You just focus on drawing. Focus on resting." "Did you go to work?" The boy's voice was a fragile whisper. "I'm heading there soon." Arthur adjusted the blankets, ensuring the sensor wires weren't pinching the boy's skin. "Mr. Robert is going to come sit with you this afternoon. He's bringing the cherry pie you like." Thomas managed a weak, gap-toothed smile. "Tell him no crust, just the red stuff." "No crust, just the red stuff. Deal." Arthur leaned down, pressing a kiss against the crown of his son's head. "I love you, Thomas. More than the sun." "More than the sun," the boy echoed, his eyes already drifting shut again as the medication pulled him back into the dark. Arthur waited until the breathing stabilized into a deep rhythm. He checked the monitors, memorizing the blood oxygen levels, the heart rate, the fluid drip intervals. He had become a ghost student of pediatric cardiology, absorbing every terrifying metric. He grabbed his heavy canvas work jacket from the chair. He had $140,000 to find, and the clock had already started bleeding time. The blast of Chicago winter hit him like a physical blow as he pushed through the hospital's revolving glass doors. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, carrying shards of sleet that stung his cheeks. It was 4:15 a.m. The city was a desolate expanse of concrete and freezing shadows. He walked 4 blocks to the elevated train station, his boots crunching through the salted slush. 3 years ago, Arthur Brooks would have been stepping into a heated town car. Before the cancer, before the medical bills consumed their savings, their mortgage, and his career. He had been a senior risk analyst for a mid-tier financial firm on the Loop. He wore bespoke suits, dissected market volatility algorithms, and predicted corporate collapse with terrifying accuracy. But the firm demanded 80-hour weeks, constant travel, and absolute devotion. When Maya got sick and the brutal reality of hospice care collided with a toddler who didn't understand why his mother couldn't hold him, Arthur made the only choice a father could. He requested a leave of absence. The firm refused. He resigned. By the time the funeral was over, the medical debt had devoured his professional reputation. Gap years on a resume were unforgivable in high finance. He needed jobs with absolute flexibility, shifts he could drop at a moment's notice when Thomas spiked a fever or his lungs filled with fluid. So the brilliant analytical mind that once projected quarterly yields for Fortune 500 companies was now applied to the complex electrical grids of commercial boilers and the precise choreography of high-end restaurant service. The L train rattled along the frozen tracks, a hollow metal tube cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Arthur sat in the corner, a small, cracked notebook resting on his knee. He chewed the end of a cheap ballpoint pen, his mind building a ruthless financial model. He currently made $24 an hour as a freelance commercial maintenance technician. He averaged 30 hours a week there. That was $720. His morning shifts at the Oak Room, an ultra-exclusive dining room in the financial district, brought in roughly $500 a week in tips and base pay. $1,200 a week, $4,800 a month. Rent was $1,400. Oxygen tanks, Thomas's daily beta blockers, and specialized nutrition shakes drained another $1,500. Electricity, transit, and basic groceries took the rest. The margin of error was zero. To generate $140,000 in 7 weeks required a weekly yield of $20,000. The math was impossible. It defied every law of economics he had ever studied. But Arthur closed the notebook and shoved it into his pocket. He did not have the luxury of acknowledging the impossible. At 5:30 a.m., Arthur pushed open the heavy steel service doors of the towering glass and steel monolith on Wacker Drive. The basement level was a labyrinth of exposed pipes, roaring ventilation shafts, and the heavy smell of ozone and industrial grease. This was his first shift. Mike, the head building engineer, a burly man with a permanent scowl and grease-stained overalls, was kicking the side of a massive central HVAC control unit when Arthur walked in. Sparks hissed from a blown junction box. "Whole eastern quadrant is frozen out," Mike barked, not bothering to look up. "The corporate suits on floor 40 are going to have my head if the heat isn't pumping by 8. The primary relay keeps tripping the breaker. I've swapped the fuses twice. System's garbage." Arthur dropped his canvas bag on a metal workbench. He unzipped his jacket, pulled a pair of heavy rubberized gloves from his back pocket, and walked over to the open electrical panel. He didn't just see a jumble of colored wires and blown fuses. His mind automatically mapped the circuitry, tracing the flow of current like he used to trace capital through shell corporations. "You're treating the symptom, Mike, not the cause," Arthur said quietly, pulling a multimeter from his belt. He touched the prongs to the secondary capacitor. The needle barely twitched. "The relay is tripping because the variable frequency drive on the intake fan is failing. It's drawing triple the amperage to push the frozen air. You swap the fuse, it's just going to blow again to protect the main board." Mike wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a smear of black grease. "So we bypass the drive?" "No, you bypass the drive. You risk a catastrophic surge to the rooftop chillers. That's a $100,000 mistake." Arthur reached deep into the tangled wiring, his fingers moving with surgical precision. He disconnected the failing drive, rerouting the power supply through a redundant parallel circuit designed for emergency overload. "I'm bridging the load to the secondary loop. It'll run at 80% capacity, enough to heat floor 40, but it'll buy you the 3 days you need to order a replacement drive." Arthur tightened the final terminal screw, stepped back, and flipped the massive industrial breaker. The machinery groaned, a deep, resonant hum vibrating through the concrete floor. The red warning lights on the diagnostic panel flickered, then shifted to a steady operational green. Warm air immediately began cycling through the massive overhead ducts. Mike stared at the panel, then looked at Arthur, shaking his head. "You're wasted down here, Brooks. You got a brain like a supercomputer. Why the hell are you turning wrenches in a basement?" "Wrenches pay hourly, Mike, and they don't ask for a weekend retreat." Arthur wiped his hands on a rag, already moving toward the employee showers. "Clock me in for the full 3 hours. I need to be uptown by 8. By 7:45 a.m., the grease-stained maintenance worker had vanished. In his place stood a man of immaculate composure, dressed in the crisp, heavily starched white shirt, black vest, and tailored trousers required by the Oak Room. The restaurant was a cathedral of wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Chicago River. The tables were draped in heavy linen, set with imported crystal and polished silver. This was where the city's apex predators, CEOs, hedge fund managers, political brokers, came to consume truffles and dictate the local economy over breakfast. Arthur stood at his assigned station near the private alcoves. His posture was military straight, his expression a carefully constructed mask of professional invisibility. He knew the rules of this room perfectly. Do not speak unless addressed. Anticipate the need before it is voiced. Become part of the architecture. At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy mahogany doors opened and the atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to subtly shift. Claire Kensington walked in. She was 38, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Kensington Enterprises, a massive commercial real estate conglomerate she had inherited after a vicious boardroom war following her father's stroke. She wore a tailored slate gray suit that armored her slender frame perfectly. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, unforgiving twist, but it was her eyes that commanded the space, a pale, icy blue that scanned the room with the ruthless calculation of a general surveying a battlefield. She projected an aura of absolute terrifying competence, masking a deep, isolating loneliness that Arthur, an expert in reading hidden deficits, recognized instantly. The maitre d' scrambled to escort her to her preferred table in the corner alcove, a secluded spot flanked by heavy velvet curtains. Arthur moved silently, pouring the chilled, sparkling water precisely as she sat down, the water level stopping exactly 1 inch from the crystal rim. Claire did not look at him. She immediately opened a thick leather portfolio, her eyes darting across a spreadsheet detailing corporate acquisitions. She was fighting a war on 2 fronts, hostile competitors trying to bleed her market share and internal vultures circling her leadership. Chief among them was Richard Vance, her former fiancé and current majority shareholder, a man who viewed her ascension as a personal insult to be corrected through sabotage. Black coffee, no sugar. The smoked salmon, lightly poached egg, dry rye, Claire ordered, her voice sharp, dismissive, entirely focused on the document. Immediately, Miss Kensington, Arthur replied, his voice a low, soothing hum that did not disturb her concentration. He moved toward the kitchen doors. The morning rush was beginning. The floor was a chaotic ballet of servers balancing heavy silver trays, the air thick with the smell of roasting espresso and truffles. Emma, a 19-year-old college student on her 3rd day of service, came rushing out of the kitchen. She was carrying a massive circular tray loaded with 4 heavy crystal pitchers of ice water and a stack of ceramic plates. Her hands were shaking. She was visibly overwhelmed, her eyes wide with panic as she navigated the narrow corridor between the bustling tables. Arthur saw the disaster forming 3 seconds before it happened. It was a failure of spatial mechanics. Emma's trajectory was angled too sharply toward the corner alcove. Her left foot caught the thick raised seam of the Persian rug separating the main dining floor from the private sections. The physics were undeniable. Emma lunged forward, a sharp gasp escaping her throat. The heavy tray pitched violently. 4 pitchers of ice water launched into the air, a crystalline wave of disaster aimed directly at the back of Claire Kensington's pristine gray suit. Arthur did not think. He moved. He crossed the 6 feet of open space with terrifying speed, a blur of white and black. He didn't reach for the tray, it was already gone. Instead, he lunged directly into the path of the falling water, his broad back absorbing the entire impact. The ice water slammed into his spine, soaking through his vest and shirt in a freezing, heavy shock. The crystal pitchers shattered against the hardwood floor with a deafening crash, sending shards of glass exploding in all directions. Silence slammed into the dining room. Dozens of wealthy patrons stopped eating, forks suspended in midair. Claire Kensington jerked upright, dropping her pen, her eyes wide as she turned around. She saw the shattered glass, the terrified, weeping teenager on the floor, and the tall, broad-shouldered waiter standing perfectly still, water dripping steadily from his soaked uniform onto the Persian rug. Not a single drop had touched her. The restaurant manager, a high-strung man named Gregory, came sprinting across the floor, his face flushed purple with rage. He looked at the mess, then glared down at Emma, who was desperately trying to gather the broken glass with bare, trembling hands. "You clumsy, incompetent idiot!" Gregory hissed, his voice carrying the sharp whip of corporate cruelty. "Get up! Get out of this dining room! You are fired! Do not even bother clocking out!" Emma let out a ragged sob, tears streaking her makeup as she scrambled to her feet, humiliated in front of the city's elite. Arthur stood up straight. The freezing water clung to his skin, but his posture remained absolute rock. He stepped squarely between the furious manager and the weeping girl. "The termination is unwarranted, Gregory," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deep, resonant authority that commanded the entire alcove. It was the voice of a man who used to dictate terms to Wall Street bankers. Gregory blinked, momentarily derailed by the shift in power. "Excuse me? Brooks, look at this mess. She almost drenched Ms. Kensington. She tripped on the uneven seam of the rug, a maintenance issue I logged in the hazard book 3 days ago," Arthur stated, his gaze level, unyielding. "Furthermore, I was stationed in the blind spot of the corridor. I impeded her line of sight. The fault is shared." Gregory sneered, looking at Arthur's soaked shirt. "You're covering for her. I saw the whole thing. She dropped it." Arthur stepped 1 inch closer. He looked Gregory directly in the eyes. "Dignity isn't a luxury you can price, Gregory. It's the spine that keeps a man standing. I have dignity. I deserve respect, and so does she. I take my share of the blame. If you fire her for a structural hazard, you will be replacing 2 servers this morning." The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. The threat was real. Arthur was the most efficient, flawless server on the floor, handling the VIPs with effortless grace. Losing him mid-shift would be a disaster. Claire Kensington sat frozen in her leather chair, her pale blue eyes locked onto Arthur. She was a woman who navigated a world built entirely on blame deflection, corporate backstabbing, and the constant, desperate scrambling for power. She watched men in $1,000 suits throw their subordinates under the bus every single day to save a fraction of a percentage point. And here was a waiter, earning a marginal wage, soaking wet, putting his own livelihood on the line to shield a terrified teenager from the wrath of middle management. He didn't ask for credit. He didn't cower. He stood his ground with a moral clarity that struck Claire like a physical blow. "Gregory?" Claire's voice cut through the tension, sharp and cold as a scalpel. The manager spun around, instantly transforming from a tyrant to a sycophant. "Miss Kensington, I am so profoundly sorry for this disruption. I assure you, you will assure me of nothing," Claire interrupted, picking up her pen and turning her attention back to her spreadsheet. "The rug is a hazard. Have it fixed. The girl stays, and this man—" She paused, her eyes flickering up to meet Arthur's dark, calm gaze. "Will be the only server permitted to attend my table from now on. Is that understood?" Gregory swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Implicitly, Miss Kensington, right away." He gestured frantically to a busboy to clean the glass, then scurried away, dragging a stunned, weeping Emma toward the kitchen. Arthur remained by the table. "I apologize for the disturbance, Ms. Kensington. I will have a replacement shirt from my locker and return with your coffee in precisely 3 minutes. Take your time, Mr. Brooks. Arthur Brooks, ma'am. Take your time, Mr. Brooks. I am not in a rush today." When Arthur returned, dressed in a dry uniform, Claire ate in total silence. She did not look up from her paperwork, but the frantic, defensive energy that usually surrounded her seemed marginally subdued. When she finally stood to leave, snapping her portfolio shut, she did not wait for the check. Arthur approached the table to clear the pristine silver. Tucked beneath the edge of the empty coffee cup, folded with deliberate precision, was a stack of 5 crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. $500 for a $30 breakfast. Arthur stared at the green paper. The oxygen tanks, the copays, the specialized nutrition shakes, it was a drop of water in the vast, burning desert of the $140,000 he needed, but it was survival for the weak. He closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. the image of Thomas's pale face flashing behind his eyelids. The pattern established itself with an unsettling rhythm. Every morning at 8, Claire Kensington arrived at the Oak Room. She demanded Arthur's section. She ordered the same black coffee, the same smoked salmon. She rarely spoke, burying herself in corporate warfare, analyzing hostile takeover bids orchestrated by Richard Vance. And every morning when she left, a neatly folded stack of $500 remained beneath her cup. By the end of the second week, Arthur had managed to bank $4,000. It was a terrifyingly slow accumulation, but the paralyzing grip of immediate poverty had slightly loosened. He could afford the premium pediatric beta blockers without skipping his own meals. Thursday morning of the third week brought a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure. The city was locked in a brutal deep freeze. The restaurant windows were frosted at the edges. Claire arrived 10 minutes late, an anomaly that signaled chaos in her rigid world. The armored perfection of her slate-gray suit was intact, but the dark circles under her pale blue eyes betrayed a profound exhaustion. Arthur poured the black coffee. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she reached for the cup. "The hostile bid is advancing," Claire murmured, speaking to the steam rising from the porcelain. It was the first time she had spoken a sentence unrelated to her order. It was a breach of the unspoken contract, a momentary slipping of the mask. Arthur paused, the silver carafe hovering an inch above the table. He recognized the tone. It was the sound of a commander realizing the fortress walls were breached. He relied on his instinct, the analytical mind that still processed data faster than anyone in the room. "A hostile bid only thrives on perceived instability, Ms. Kensington," Arthur said quietly, his voice a steady anchor in the quiet alcove. "If the board senses fear, the stock price dilutes. The predator uses your equity to finance his own attack." Claire froze. She slowly looked up, her piercing blue eyes locking onto the waiter. Her mind, usually operating a dozen chess moves ahead, ground to a halt. A server bringing coffee had just accurately summarized the exact leveraged buyout strategy Richard Vance was deploying against her company. "Where did you learn corporate defense strategy, Mr. Brooks?" she asked, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. Arthur's face remained an impassive mask, but a flicker of old grief sparked in his dark eyes. "I read a great deal, ma'am. Will there be anything else?" "Stay exactly where you are." Claire closed her portfolio. She leaned back in her leather chair, really looking at him for the first time. She didn't just see the crisp white shirt or the practiced posture. Her eyes tracked downward, landing on his shoes. They were black leather Oxfords. High quality, perhaps Italian, but they were old. The leather was deeply creased across the vamp, the soles restitched, the heels worn down at a slight angle. But they were polished to a mirror shine, meticulously buffed until the scuffs disappeared into a deep, reflective black. Claire's father, a ruthless, self-made titan of industry, had told her once before he died, "You can measure the exact weight of a man's character by how he treats the things he cannot afford to replace. A man who polishes broken leather hasn't given up. He's preparing for a war." "You work another job before you come here," Claire stated. It wasn't a question. She could see the faint shadow of industrial grease permanently etched into the cuticles of his large, capable hands. "Maintenance, ma'am. Commercial HVAC. You have the intellect of a senior analyst, the protective instinct of a bodyguard, and you work maintenance and food service." Claire folded her hands on the table. "Why?" Arthur thought of Thomas. He thought of the terrifying rhythmic beep of the hospital monitor, the blue tint on his son's lips, the countdown of the 56 days that haunted every waking second of his life. "I require schedule flexibility," Arthur answered, his voice tightening slightly. "My son, Thomas, he is 6. He was born with a severe mitral valve defect. He requires constant medical supervision. The corporate sector does not accommodate the unpredictable nature of pediatric heart failure." The words hung in the air between them. Claire felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest, a strange, hollow sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She lived in a world where men traded companies like poker chips, where crisis meant a dip in quarterly dividends. Here was a man fighting a literal battle for his child's heartbeat, fighting it with a quiet, devastating dignity that made her own corporate wars feel suddenly violently trivial. "How much time does he have?" Claire asked softly. 5 weeks, Arthur replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with unflinching honesty. "Without a total mechanical replacement. The deposit is $140,000. I am currently saving." Claire did the math instantly. It was the curse of her profession. A waiter and a maintenance man could not save that amount in 5 weeks. It was an impossibility. Yet looking into Arthur Brooks's eyes, she saw no defeat. She saw only a terrifying, absolute resolve. He would tear the copper wire out of the city grid with his bare hands before he let his son die. She opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored business card, embossed with a silver crest. She slid it across the linen tablecloth. "I am hosting a private dinner tomorrow evening at my residence, a gathering of senior board members. It is highly sensitive. The catering staff provided by the firm is indiscreet. I require someone who understands the architecture of a room, who knows how to be invisible, and who possesses absolute integrity." Claire looked up, her pale eyes locking onto his. "I will pay you $2,000 for 4 hours of service." $2,000. Arthur stared at the embossed silver crest. It was a massive leap forward. It was 4 days of premium medication, a direct infusion into the escrow account that held Thomas's life. But more than the money, Arthur recognized the shift in the power dynamic. The Ice Queen was not offering charity. She was hiring competence. She was recognizing his dignity. "I will be there, Miss. Be there. Kensington," Arthur said, carefully picking up the card and sliding it into his vest pocket. "What time?" 7 o'clock. The address is on the card." Claire stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. The armored facade slid back into place, but the absolute coldness in her eyes had thawed, replaced by a calculating, quiet respect. As she walked toward the exit, she didn't leave the $500 under the cup. She had offered something vastly more dangerous. She had offered him entry into her world. That evening, the biting Chicago wind rattled the thin glass of Arthur's apartment window. The space was tiny, a cramped one-bedroom walk-up over a dry cleaner in the South Loop. The heat worked sporadically, forcing Arthur to tape thick plastic sheeting over the drafty frames. But the walls were covered in Thomas's drawings, explosions of crayon color depicting superheroes, spaceships, and tall men holding umbrellas. Arthur stood by the small kitchenette, boiling water for pasta. Robert, the 60-year-old owner of the diner down the street, sat in the worn armchair by the radiator. Robert was a fixture in their lives, a surrogate grandfather who smelled permanently of black coffee and frying bacon. He was currently losing a game of checkers to Thomas, who sat cross-legged on the rug, an oxygen cannula looped over his small ears, the clear plastic tubing trailing to a heavy green tank near the sofa. "King me, Mr. Robert," Thomas announced, his voice raspy, a wide, gap-toothed smile breaking across his tired face. Robert chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. He moved the plastic checker. "You're a ruthless tactician, Tommy. You got your daddy's brain, that's for sure. No mercy for an old man." Arthur watched them, a fierce, protective warmth blooming in his chest, instantly chased by the cold dread of the ticking clock. 5 weeks. 35 days. The margin was so narrow he felt he was walking a tightrope over a black abyss, balancing his son on his shoulders. "I have a private catering job tomorrow night," Arthur said, pouring the boiling water into a strainer. Steam plumed into the cold air. "It pays well, really well. 2,000. Robert looked up, his thick gray eyebrows raising. $2,000 for one night of pouring wine? Who are you working for, the ghost of Al Capone?" "A CEO, a regular from the Oak Room." Arthur served the pasta into 2 plastic bowls, adding a small amount of butter and cheese to Thomas's. He had to pack the calories in. The boy was losing weight too fast. It's legitimate, but I need you to watch him until midnight. You know I will, Arthur. Don't even ask. Robert stood up, his joints popping, and walked over to the narrow counter. He lowered his voice so the boy wouldn't hear. But you be careful. People with that kind of money, they don't hand out favors, they buy leverage. You make sure you know exactly what you're stepping into. I'm stepping into the surgical deposit, Arthur replied, his jaw tight. I don't care about their leverage. I care about the heartbeat monitor. He carried the bowl over to Thomas. The boy looked up, his dark eyes large and solemn in his thin face. He pushed a piece of drawing paper toward Arthur. I drew the lady, Thomas said softly. Arthur looked at the paper. It was a stark departure from the boy's usual colorful explosions. It was a figure drawn entirely in gray and black crayon. A woman in a suit, standing inside a tall glass bar. There were no monsters, no storms, just the woman, completely isolated. What lady, Tommy? Arthur asked, a strange chill crawling up his arms. The one you told Mr. Robert about, the one with the money. Thomas pointed a small, trembling finger at the drawing. The lady with no smile, she's trapped in the ice. Children possess a terrifying, unvarnished wisdom. They do not see the armored suits, the bank accounts, or the corporate titles. They see the emotional frequency of the room. Thomas, who spent his days observing the world through the slow, agonizing filter of a failing heart, had perfectly diagnosed the chief executive officer of Kensington Enterprises. She's not trapped, buddy, Arthur said, taking the drawing and folding it carefully. She's just fighting her own kind of battles. Are you fighting bad guys, Daddy? Thomas asked, taking a tiny bite of the pasta, the effort already exhausting him. I'm just fixing the pipes, Tommy, just making sure the heat stays on. Arthur smoothed the boy's hair, forcing down the lump rising in his throat. Intent doesn't erase impact. He could have all the good intentions in the world. He could work himself to the bone, but if he didn't secure that money, the impact would be a small, devastating slunce in this room. The next evening, the gold-leafed elevator doors of the Gold Coast high-rise opened directly into Claire Kensington's penthouse. Arthur stepped out, carrying his pressed uniform in a garment bag. The sheer scale of the wealth was disorienting. The apartment spanned the entire top floor, a sprawling expanse of white marble, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering grid of Chicago and modern art that cost more than Arthur would earn in a lifetime. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, oppressive. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum waiting for a curator. Claire's head of staff, an older, severe woman named Mrs. Higgins, directed Arthur to the massive stainless steel catering kitchen. Ms. Kensington expects absolute discretion. The guests are arriving at 7:30. Pour the wine, clear the plates. Do not linger, do not listen. Understood? Perfectly, Arthur said. He changed into his uniform, the familiar crisp white shirt and black vest acting as his own form of armor. He checked his reflection in the polished steel of the refrigerator door. The honorable everyman. He had dignity. He had purpose. The ticking clock in his head flashed. 34 days. At 7:30 p.m., the guests arrived. There were 6 of them, older men in bespoke suits radiating the casual, dangerous arrogance of extreme wealth. They were the senior board members of Kensington Enterprises. The atmosphere in the massive dining room was immediately toxic. It was a thinly veiled interrogation disguised as a dinner party. Claire sat at the head of the long mahogany table wearing a dark navy dress that looked like a military tunic. She was entirely surrounded by enemies. Arthur moved around the table with spectral santu, pouring a vintage Bordeaux into crystal glasses. His movements were fluid, precise, completely invisible, but his mind, the hyper-vigilant analytical engine he thought he had buried, was wide awake. He listened. He couldn't help it. The quarterly projections are weak, Claire, A heavy-set man with silver hair drawled, swirling his wine. Richard believes the logistics division is bleeding capital. He's proposing a total liquidation of the Midwest assets, and frankly, the board is inclined to agree with him. Richard Vance. The name hung in the air like poison gas. The ex-fiancé. The predator. Richard is using outdated metrics to justify a fire sale that will only benefit his private equity partners, Claire countered. Her voice calm, icy, but Arthur could see the white-knuckle grip she had on her linen napkin under the table. The logistics division is currently absorbing the upfront costs of automated integration. The yield curve will invert in 6 months. 6 months is an eternity in this market, another board member sneered. Richard has the votes, Claire. He's calling for an emergency session next week. If you can't present a bulletproof counterstructure, the board will strip your executive authority. They were going to execute her. Arthur recognized the strategy instantly. It was a classic corporate siege. Starve the executive of support, manipulate the data to create panic, and install a puppet. Richard Vance wasn't just trying to take her company. He was trying to humiliate her, to dismantle her legacy piece by piece. Arthur moved to the sideboard to retrieve the main course, a tray of roasted lamb. As he stood there, his eyes fell upon a thick, leather-bound dossier resting on the marble counter. It was marked Confidential, Vance Logistics Proposal. It was the document the board was using to hang her. Arthur shouldn't have looked. It was a violation of the absolute rule of service, but the numbers drew him in. His eyes scanned the open page, processing the columns of data, the projected depreciation, the asset valuations. A cold shock of adrenaline hit his system. The math was a lie. It was brilliantly disguised, buried under layers of complex amortization schedules. But the core foundation was rotten. Richard Vance was artificially inflating the projected losses by double-counting the depreciation of the physical fleet, while simultaneously writing off the software integration as a sunk cost. It was phantom debt. He was creating a fake crisis to steal the company. Arthur picked up the heavy silver tray of lamb. He walked back into the dining room. The argument had escalated, the board members openly aggressive now, sensing blood in the water. Claire's armor was holding, but the cracks were showing. Her breathing was shallow, her pale eyes darting between the men, searching for an angle, a defense. Arthur approached her left side to serve the meat. He leaned in, the silver tongs perfectly steady. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the plate. His voice was a whisper, pitched perfectly beneath the hum of the room, meant only for her ear. Page 42 of the Vance proposal. Arthur breathed, sliding the lamb onto her porcelain plate. He's double-counting the fleet depreciation against the software capital. It's phantom debt. Run a cross-reference on the Schedule C tax filings. The loss is fictional. Claire stiffened. The shift in her posture was microscopic, but Arthur felt it. For a fraction of a second, her mask completely shattered. Shock, confusion, and then a blinding, razor-sharp realization flooded her pale eyes. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She smoothly picked up her silver fork, her hand trembling just slightly. "Gentlemen," Claire said, her voice suddenly echoing with a terrifying absolute authority that silenced the room. She looked down the length of the table, the Ice Queen fully resurrected, armed with a lethal weapon. "If Richard wishes to call an emergency session, let him. But I suggest you all review page 42 of his proposal and cross-reference it with our Schedule C filings. Because if you vote to liquidate based on fraudulent depreciation models, the SEC will not be investigating me. They will be investigating you." The silence in the room was absolute, deafening. The silver-haired man choked on his wine. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the sudden cold sweat of men who realized they were holding a live grenade. Arthur stepped back into the shadows of the room, his face an impassive mask, his hands clasped behind his back. The honorable everyman, he had done his job, he had served the food. At 11:30 p.m., the penthouse was empty of guests. The board members had fled, terrified of the SEC implication. The vast apartment was quiet once again. Arthur stood in the kitchen, folding his apron, preparing to leave. Mrs. Higgins had already handed him the thick envelope containing $2,000 in cash. He was calculating the deposit, planning the exact route to the bank in the morning. "Mr. Brooks," Arthur turned. Claire Kensington stood in the doorway of the kitchen. The armored suit was gone. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and dark trousers. The severe twist in her hair had loosened, dark strands falling around her face. She looked exhausted, vulnerable, and intensely curious. She held the Vance dossier in her hands. "I verified the numbers," Claire said softly, stepping into the sterile light of the kitchen. "You were right. It was brilliantly hidden. My own forensic accountants missed it. I missed it. People see what they are primed to expect, Ms. Kensington. They expected a crisis, so they accepted the math that proved it." Arthur picked up his canvas jacket. "I am glad I could be of assistance." "Who are you?" Claire asked, closing the distance between them. The distance between the billionaire CEO and the blue-collar maintenance worker evaporated in the heavy silence. "You don't just read a great deal. You analyzed a highly complex, fraudulent financial structure in 30 seconds while serving lamb. Who are you, Arthur?" Arthur looked at her. He saw the lady trapped in the ice, desperate for an ally. He thought of the 34 days remaining on the clock. "My name is Arthur Brooks. I am a father. 3 years ago, I was a senior risk analyst at Sterling & Cross. Now, I fix boilers and serve breakfast because my son's heart is failing and my dignity is the only thing the medical debt hasn't consumed." He zipped his jacket. "Good night, Ms. Kensington." "Wait." Claire stepped directly into his path. Her pale blue eyes were burning with an intensity he had never seen before. "Richard Vance is not just trying to take my company. I believe he is using the corporate structure to launder capital through offshore shell entities. He is a predator, and he is going to destroy everything my family built to cover his tracks." Arthur stood perfectly still. The danger in the room spiked. "I cannot fight him alone anymore," Claire said, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "My internal team is compromised. The board is bought. I need an analyst, someone completely off the grid, someone he would never suspect, who understands how to trace phantom capital." She looked at the heavy canvas jacket, the worn, polished shoes. "I need a ghost, Arthur." Claire took a deep breath. "You continue your morning shifts at the restaurant. It maintains the cover. But at night, you work for me. You trace Richard's money. You find the structural flaw in his laundering operation. You give me the weapon to destroy him." Arthur felt the weight of the proposal settling over his shoulders. It was dangerous. Richard Vance was a man who played with millions, a man who crushed lives without a second thought. Stepping into this war was stepping into the crosshairs of a leviathan. "And my compensation?" Arthur asked, his voice low, steady. Claire did not blink. $140,000, deposited directly into the hospital's surgical escrow account the moment you find the proof I need." The number echoed in the vast, empty kitchen. 140,000, the exact price of a heartbeat. The mountain had just collapsed into a staircase. Arthur thought of Thomas, sleeping under the plastic oxygen tubes. He thought of the promise he made to Maya in the dark hospital room. Courage has a cost, but cowardice costs everything. Arthur extended his large, calloused hand. "I require access to the primary server ledgers," Arthur said, his voice cold, analytical. The risk analyst fully resurrected from the ashes of grief. "And I require it by tomorrow night." Claire looked at his hand, then reached out, her pale, slender fingers gripping his calloused palm. The deal was struck in the shadows. "You'll have it," she said. Arthur turned and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy envelope of cash in his pocket. The Chicago wind outside was brutal, screaming between the skyscrapers. But for the first time in 3 years, Arthur Brooks did not feel the cold. The war had begun, the clock was ticking, and the honorable everyman was finally armed. The digital glow of the laptop screen cast a harsh blue pallor across the cramped kitchen. Outside the plastic-sealed windows, the Chicago wind howled a relentless, mournful pitch against the brickwork of the South Loop. It was 3:17 a.m. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of Thomas's oxygen concentrator provided a steady baseline to the frantic clicking of a mouse. Arthur rubbed his eyes, the heels of his hands pressing hard against his orbital bones until starbursts danced in his vision. The fatigue was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a heavy, living entity wrapped around his spine, pulling him toward the floor. 28 days remained. The countdown was a permanent burning brand on the inside of his skull. The encrypted flash drive Claire had provided was a labyrinth of corporate obfuscation. Kensington Enterprises moved billions of dollars across the globe daily, a surging ocean of capital. Richard Vance was siphoning water from that ocean drop by drop, using a network of domestic shell companies to mask the theft. Arthur's eyes traced the cascading lines of the general ledger, his mind shifting into the hyper-analytical gear he hadn't used since Wall Street. The numbers were beautiful in their terrible logic. He tracked a series of anomalous vendor payouts originating from the logistics division. Millions of dollars allocated for fleet modernization and proprietary software upgrades. The capital flowed into a corporate account in Chicago, then immediately fragmented. Arthur's fingers flew across the worn keyboard, pulling up domestic registry databases. He traced the fragments. They were funneling into 3 distinct limited liability companies registered in Nevada. The LLCs had no physical storefronts, no payroll records, and their corporate officers were listed as anonymous proxy services. It was ghost architecture. A sharp, jagged cough echoed from the living room. Arthur instantly pushed back from the table, the wooden chair scraping against the linoleum. He crossed the short distance in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside the fold-out sofa. Thomas was curled onto his side, his small hands clutching the faded blue blanket. The clear plastic cannula had slipped slightly from his nostrils. Arthur gently adjusted the tubing, smoothing the sweat-dampened curls from the boy's forehead. The child's skin felt too cool, the dreadful faint blue tint lingering around his lips despite the steady flow of concentrated oxygen. Arthur rested his calloused hand flat against the boy's narrow chest. He could feel the erratic, terrifying flutter of the failing mitral valve beneath the ribs. A desperate, broken rhythm, a fierce, protective agony bloomed in his throat. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against the mattress beside his son's pillow. He allowed himself exactly 10 seconds of weakness, 10 seconds to feel the crushing, suffocating weight of the universe bearing down on this tiny apartment. Then he inhaled deeply, locking the terror away in a reinforced vault in his mind. Panic was a luxury. Survival required absolute cold calculation. He stood up, adjusted the thermostat to push a meager wave of warm air into the room, and returned to the laptop. The Nevada LLCs were just a staging ground. The money couldn't stay there. It had to be consolidated and cleaned. Arthur initiated a complex algorithmic search, cross-referencing the tax identification numbers of the Nevada proxies with property records and asset management firms. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, a digital heartbeat. At 4:45 a.m., the algorithm returned a hit. The fragmented funds were pooling into a blind trust registered in Delaware. Arthur pulled the corporate filing for the trust. The beneficiary was shielded, a standard legal maneuver to ensure absolute anonymity. But the managing director, the signatory authorized to move the consolidated millions, was listed in plain text: Marcus Sterling, Esquire. Arthur stared at the name. He remembered the hostile board members from the penthouse dinner. He remembered the specific arrogant drawl of the silver-haired man who had sneered at Claire's logistics data. Marcus Sterling was Richard Vance's personal attorney. The circle was complete. The phantom debt was real, and the money was flowing directly into Vance's pockets to finance his hostile takeover of the very company he was robbing. Arthur saved the dataset, partitioned the drive, and initiated a military-grade encryption sequence. He had the weapon Claire needed. Now, he just had to deliver it without blowing his cover. 4 hours later, the towering glass walls of the oak room reflected the pale, freezing morning sun. The dining room hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of power breakfasts. Arthur stood at his station, his posture rigid, his white shirt blindingly crisp. The physical exhaustion was buried deep under layers of adrenaline and professional discipline. Claire Kensington walked through the heavy mahogany doors at precisely 8 a.m. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted, though to the casual observer nothing had changed. She wore a tailored suit of midnight blue, her expression the familiar, impenetrable mask of the Ice Queen. She did not look at him as the maitre d' escorted her to the corner alcove. Arthur approached with the silver water pitcher. He poured the chilled liquid, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. A sleek black leather check presenter lay flat against the linen tablecloth, positioned exactly 2 inches from her left hand. "The smoked salmon, dry rye, black coffee," Claire ordered, her eyes fixed on the Financial Times open before her. "Immediately, Ms. Kensington." Arthur's voice was a low, deferential hum. As he turned to leave, his left hand brushed the edge of the table. In a movement so fluid it defied detection, he slid a tiny encrypted micro-USB drive beneath the leather flope of the check presenter. Claire did not react. Her eyes continued to scan the newsprint. From across the dining room, Gregory, the restaurant manager, stood near the hostess stand. His eyes were narrowed, tracking Arthur's movements. Ever since the incident with the spilled water, Gregory had harbored a quiet, simmering resentment toward his best server. He resented Arthur's unnatural composure, the quiet dignity that refused to bow to petty managerial tyranny. Gregory watched the brief interaction at the corner table, his predatory instincts twitching, sensing an anomaly he couldn't quite define. When Arthur returned with the silver tray bearing her breakfast, the check presenter was gone, vanished into the depths of Claire's designer handbag. She took a slow sip of the black coffee. "The board is demanding a preliminary vote on the logistics liquidation by Friday." Her voice was barely a whisper aimed down at the porcelain cup. "The Delaware Trust," Arthur murmured, adjusting the silverware with microscopic precision. "Marcus Sterling is the managing signatory. The Nevada LLCs are just a funnel. It's a closed loop, financing the takeover with stolen capital. The data is on the drive. You have the leverage." A fraction of the tension left Claire's shoulders. The armored facade softened, just for a millisecond, revealing the exhausted, deeply isolated woman beneath. "Tonight, 8 o'clock, Claire breathed. "I need you to walk me through the forensic routing. I need to understand the exact architecture before I drop the guillotine on the board." Arthur froze, the silver tray hovering at his side. He thought of Robert, who was pulling a double shift at the diner today. He thought of the erratic, terrifying rhythm of the mitral valve. "I am unavailable tonight, Ms. Kensington." Claire finally looked up, her pale blue eyes sharp with sudden alarm. In her world, subordinates did not refuse a direct summons. "This is the critical phase, Arthur. The data requires context." "My son requires his father," Arthur replied, his voice a steady, immovable stone. "The evening caregiver is unavailable. I cannot leave him alone in the apartment. The medical risk is too high." The Ice Queen stared at the waiter. She was accustomed to buying time, loyalty, and priority. She opened her mouth, ready to offer a staggering sum of money for 5 hours of his evening. But the words died in her throat. She looked at his polished, worn shoes. She remembered the fierce, protective authority in his voice when he shielded the young waitress. He was not negotiating. He was stating an absolute law of his universe. "I will send a secure courier for any supplemental documents," Claire said smoothly, instantly adjusting her strategy. She picked up her fork, returning her gaze to the newspaper. Arthur bowed his head slightly and retreated to his station. The honorable everyman did not compromise his core duties. Not for billionaires, not for corporate wars. The evening sky over Chicago bruised into a deep, freezing purple. The wind battered the South Loop, rattling the street signs and whistling through the alleyways. Inside the small apartment, the air was thick with the smell of cheap heating coils and the antiseptic tang of medical supplies. Arthur sat on the edge of the fold-out sofa, a worn hardcover book resting on his knees. Thomas was propped up against a mountain of pillows, the oxygen cannula taped securely across his cheeks. The boy's breathing was labored, a wet, heavy sound that sent spikes of raw terror straight into Arthur's heart. "Read the one about the mountain, Daddy?" Thomas whispered, his dark eyes heavy with exhaustion. Arthur opened the book. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was an old, illustrated collection of Greek myths he had found at a thrift store. "Atlas," Arthur began, his deep baritone filling the small room, a vibration that seemed to settle the frantic energy in the air. He was a titan, the strongest of them all, but he was given a terrible job. He had to stand at the very edge of the world and hold the entire sky on his shoulders. "Was it heavy?" Thomas asked, coughing weakly. "Heavier than anything you can imagine, Tommy. It pushed him down. It made his bones ache and his muscles burn. Every single day the sky tried to crush him." Arthur turned the page, showing an illustration of a massive, kneeling figure straining beneath a dark, starry dome. But he never let go, because he knew if he dropped it, the sky would fall and crush everyone he loved. He built a wall with his own strength. "You hold the sky, Daddy," Thomas murmured, his eyes drifting shut. Arthur's throat tightened. He reached out, his large hand gently resting on the boy's chest, feeling the broken heartbeat. "I just hold the umbrella, buddy. You're the one fighting the storm." A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the apartment door. Arthur stood up instantly, his protective instincts flaring. He glanced at the clock on the microwave. 8:15 p.m. Robert had a key and no one else visited this apartment. He crossed the small kitchen, his boots silent on the linoleum, and peered through the scratched peephole. He froze. Standing in the dimly lit, graffiti-scarred hallway, flanked by two massive men in dark suits, was Claire Kensington. She was wearing a heavy cashmere overcoat, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the unheated corridor. She looked completely alien in this environment, a diamond dropped onto a concrete floor. Arthur unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, blocking the threshold with his broad frame. "Miss Kensington," his voice was low, carrying a warning edge. "This is not a secure location." "The drive is brilliant, Arthur," Claire said, ignoring the warning. She stepped forward, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "But the legal team needs the raw hexadecimal outputs to verify the Nevada proxy servers before we can file the SEC injunction. I couldn't risk transmitting it digitally. Vance's people are monitoring the network." She held up a sleek, black leather briefcase. Arthur looked at the two security details flanking her. "They wait in the hall." "Wait by the stairs," Claire instructed the men. They nodded, retreating silently down the corridor. Arthur stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Claire stepped into the apartment. The sensory shock was immediate. She lived in penthouses with climate-controlled, purified air. Here the air was thick, carrying the smell of boiled pasta and ozone from the straining space heater. The plastic taped over the windows billowed slightly with the drafts. The space was incredibly cramped, dominated by the fold-out sofa and the hulking green oxygen tanks standing in the corner like iron sentinels. But her eyes were drawn to the walls. They were covered, edge to edge, in vibrant, chaotic crayon drawings, a riot of color against the peeling wallpaper. Arthur quickly closed the door, throwing the deadbolt. He moved to the small kitchenette table, clearing away a stack of medical bills to make room for her briefcase. "You should not have come here," Arthur said, his voice a harsh whisper. He was acutely aware of the danger her presence brought into his sanctuary. "If Vance is monitoring your network, he could be tracking your physical movements." "My security swept the vehicles. We are clean." Claire set the briefcase down, her professional armor firmly in place. "I need the outputs, Arthur. The board vote is scheduled for... Her voice trailed off. She had turned toward the living room area. Thomas was awake. The 6-year-old was sitting up slightly, the oxygen tubes trailing from his face, his dark, solemn eyes fixed entirely on the billionaire CEO standing in his living room. The Ice Queen froze. She had read the dossier her people compiled on Arthur Brooks. She knew the sterile, clinical facts of the boy's medical condition. But seeing the reality of it, the terrifying fragility of the child, the massive humming machinery keeping him alive in this freezing room, shattered the polished glass of her corporate detachment. "Hello?" Thomas rasped, his voice small but completely unafraid. Claire swallowed hard. The corporate titan capable of dismantling rival empires with a single phone call suddenly found herself entirely unsure of what to do with her hands. She took a slow, hesitant step forward. "Hello," Claire replied, her voice softer than Arthur had ever heard it. Thomas reached under his pillow. His small hand emerged holding a piece of heavy drawing paper. He extended it toward her. Arthur moved quickly, intending to intercept to protect the boundary between his world and hers. But Claire raised a hand, stopping him. She stepped to the edge of the sofa and gently took the paper from the boy's trembling fingers. She looked at the drawing. It was the sketch Thomas had made days ago. The woman in the gray suit standing utterly alone inside a tall, transparent bot, the lady with no smile trapped in the ice. Claire stared at the crude crayon lines. It was a mirror held up to her soul, reflecting a devastating absolute truth. She had spent a decade building an impenetrable fortress around herself, a fortress of wealth, power, and ruthlessness. She had believed it was armor. This dying child, with a few strokes of wax color, had correctly identified it as a prison. A sudden, fierce, burning sensation pricked the back of her eyes. "I have something for you too," Claire whispered. She turned back to her briefcase, snapping the brass latches open. She bypassed the thick stacks of financial documents and pulled out a sleek blue manila folder. She handed it to Arthur. Arthur opened the folder. The letterhead belonged to Northwestern Memorial, the most advanced research hospital in the Midwest. "Dr. Aris Thorne is the leading cardiothoracic pediatric surgeon in the country," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly, shedding the last remnants of the Ice Queen persona. "I sit on the hospital's board of directors. I called in a favor. Dr. Thorne has reviewed Thomas's charts. He believes the mechanical replacement is viable, and he has moved Thomas to the top of his surgical queue for the moment the deposit clears." Arthur stared at the name on the paper. Dr. Thorne was a legend, a surgeon Arthur couldn't even get on the phone, let alone secure for an operation. "You used your leverage," Arthur said softly, looking up at her. "I can rebuild a corporate empire from ashes," Claire said, looking back at Thomas, a single rogue tear escaping her severe control to trace a line down her cheek. "But I have no idea how to build a family. You are fighting for the only thing that actually matters, Arthur. I won't let you lose." The emotional breakthrough was profound, a sudden, tectonic shift in the room. The transaction had transformed into a genuine alliance. Arthur stepped to his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. He pulled the raw hexadecimal outputs, the irrefutable digital DNA linking Richard Vance's domestic trusts to the Nevada shell companies. He transferred the data to a fresh encrypted drive and handed it to Claire. "This is the kill shot," Arthur said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You present this to the board, Vance goes to federal prison." Claire took the drive, her fingers brushing against his. "I present it Friday morning. The moment the vote is called, I initiate the transfer of $140,000 into the surgical escrow. We end this, Arthur." She turned, her posture straightening, the armor pulling back over her vulnerabilities as she prepared to step back into the freezing hallway. "Keep him safe." The door locked shut behind her. Arthur stood in the quiet apartment, the blue folder feeling heavy and real in his hands. The tightrope was still suspended over the abyss. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt a safety net weaving itself beneath him. But across the city, the predators were already moving in the dark. High above the glittering grid of downtown Chicago, Richard Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. He was a man crafted from expensive arrogance, wearing a tailored Italian suit that hung perfectly on his athletic frame. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch in one hand, watching the city lights bleed into the freezing lake. The heavy oak door to his office opened. A man in a nondescript brown overcoat stepped in, dropping a thick manila envelope onto the polished mahogany desk. "The sweeps were clean, Mr. Vance," the private investigator grated, his voice carrying the texture of crushed gravel. "She's not meeting with rival equity firms. She's not consulting external counsel. Her digital footprint is locked down tighter than the Pentagon." Vance turned, his handsome face twisting into a sneer of pure contempt. "Claire does not possess the forensic capability to untangle the logistics restructuring. Someone is feeding her the counter-narrative. I want to know who is in the shadows." "There is no one in the shadows," the PI said, tapping the heavy envelope. "But there is someone in the kitchen." Vance set the scotch down, his eyes narrowing. He walked to the desk and ripped open the envelope. A dozen high-resolution photographs spilled across the polished wood. The first photograph was taken through the window of the oak room. It showed Claire Kensington sitting at the corner table. Standing incredibly close to her, leaning in with an intimacy that defied the standard server-patron dynamic, was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a waiter's uniform. The second photograph was a long lens shot taken just hours ago. It showed Claire's armored SUV parked illegally on a desolate street in the South Loop. The third photograph was the kill shot. It showed Claire standing in the dimly lit hallway of a rundown apartment building, looking up at the same tall waiter. Her expression completely stripped of its usual icy control. The look on her face was raw, desperate, and deeply vulnerable. Vance stared at the photographs, his mind racing. He didn't see a corporate whistleblower. He didn't see an alliance of survival. He saw a weapon of mass destruction. In the ruthless, misogynistic theater of corporate power, a female CEO was always under a microscope. Her competence was constantly questioned, her decisions endlessly scrutinized. Vance knew exactly how to destroy her. Not with data, with a narrative. "Who is he?" Vance demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Arthur Brooks," the PI replied, reading from a small notebook. "Former risk analyst, washed out 3 years ago when his wife died. Massive medical debt. Currently working 2 blue-collar jobs to keep his kid alive. The kid has a heart defect." Vance threw his head back and laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the cavernous office. It was too perfect. It was a masterpiece of vulnerability. "She is stressed," Vance murmured, a malicious smile spreading across his face. "The pressure of the CEO position is crushing her. She feels isolated. And then this tragic, handsome grifter serving her coffee realizes she's a lonely billionaire. He targets her. He feeds her a sob story about a dying child. He manipulates her emotionally, perhaps romantically, extorting her for capital. The Ice Queen completely compromised by a waiter." "You want me to leak it to the financial press?" the PI asked. "No," Vance said, sweeping the photos back into the envelope. "The financial press will demand proof of extortion. Take this to the tabloids, the digital gossip feeds. Give them the pictures. Let the internet write the story for us. By the time the board convenes on Friday, Claire Kensington will be a laughingstock, entirely unfit for executive leadership. I won't even need a vote to remove her." The trap snapped shut in the dark. Tuesday morning broke with a deceptive, brilliant sunshine over Chicago. The sky was a hard crystalline blue. Arthur stood in the cramped bathroom, shaving with a cheap disposable razor, the hot water already running cold. 23 days. His phone, resting on the cracked porcelain sink, began to vibrate. Arthur ignored it, dragging the razor carefully across his jaw. The phone stopped. 5 seconds later, it started vibrating again. a relentless, frantic buzzing. He wiped his face with a towel and picked up the device. The screen was a chaotic cascade of notifications. Missed calls from unknown numbers, text messages from Robert consisting only of exclamation points, alerts from the local news aggregator app he kept installed for weather updates. Arthur tapped the screen. His blood turned to absolute ice. It was the front page of a massive digital tabloid network. The headline dominated the screen in brutal, screaming red text: Ice Queen's Kitchen Romance. Kensington CEO manipulated by grifter waiter. Beneath the headline was the high-resolution photograph of him leaning closely toward Claire at the Oak Room table. Swiping down revealed the photograph of Claire outside his apartment door, looking desperately vulnerable. The text was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted Arthur as a calculating predator, a man who used a fabricated sob story about a sick child to sink his claws into the lonely, desperate billionaire. It detailed his suspicious presence at her private penthouse dinner. It questioned Claire's mental stability and her fitness to run a multi-billion-dollar empire while under the hypnotic influence of a blue-collar worker. The narrative played beautifully on the darkest prejudices of society. The wealthy white female victim, the dangerous, manipulative black man from the impoverished neighborhood. It was explosive, toxic, and entirely fictional. A heavy, frantic pounding shook the front door. Arthur dropped the phone, racing to the living room. Thomas was still asleep, the oxygen machine humming steadily. Arthur threw the deadbolt and yanked the door open. Robert stood in the hallway, his face ashen, still wearing his grease-stained diner apron. He was holding a crumpled copy of the physical morning paper. The same photos, the same headline. "Arthur," Robert breathed, his chest heaving. "They're outside, the press. They found the building. There's a dozen vans out there." Arthur felt the floor tilt beneath his boots. The invisible ghost had been dragged, screaming, into the blinding spotlight. "Stay with Thomas," Arthur commanded, his voice eerily calm, the calm of a man watching a tsunami crest over the horizon. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." "Where are you going?" Robert grabbed his arm. "You step out there. They're going to tear you apart." "I have a shift," Arthur said, pulling his arm free. "If I don't show up, they win the narrative. I have dignity. I don't hide." He took the back stairs, bypassing the chaotic swarm of cameras and microphones blocking the main entrance. He slipped through the alleyway, pulling his collar up against the biting wind, moving with the practiced stealth of a man used to navigating the shadows. When he arrived at the Oak Room, the situation was catastrophic. News vans lined the curb. Paparazzi were pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, their flashbulbs exploding like erratic strobe lights trying to capture the interior of the restaurant. Arthur entered through the reinforced steel service doors in the loading dock. He walked into the kitchen. The chaotic symphony of the morning prep halted instantly. A dozen line cooks, servers, and dishwashers stopped what they were doing, staring at him with a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and thinly veiled hostility. Gregory stood in the center of the stainless steel kitchen, his face a mask of absolute furious panic. He held a tablet displaying the tabloid article. "Brooks!" Gregory hissed, the venom in his voice sharp and uncontained. "What the hell have you done?" "I arrived for my scheduled shift, Gregory," Arthur said, keeping his posture perfectly straight, refusing to shrink under the collective stare of the kitchen. "Your shift is permanently cancelled," Gregory spat, stepping forward, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur's chest. "You are a liability. You brought a media circus to my front door. You compromised a VIP client. The corporate office called 5 minutes ago. You are terminated, effective immediately. Surrender your security badge and get off my property before I call the police." Arthur looked at the red-faced manager. The injustice burned like acid in his throat, but he did not raise his voice. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the plastic keycard, and dropped it onto the metal prep counter with a sharp clack. "A man's character is forged in the dark when the audience is gone," Arthur said, his dark eyes locking onto Gregory's terrified gaze. You fire me because you fear the cameras. You are exactly what you appear to be, Gregory, nothing more. He turned and walked back out the service doors. He pulled his phone from his pocket as he stepped into the freezing alley. There was a voicemail from Mike, the head building engineer at the HVAC company. Arthur pressed play. Brooks, look man, I saw the news. Corporate called down. They saw the pictures. They have a strict morality clause for contractors handling executive floors. They think you're a liability. They told me to cut you loose. I'm sorry, Arthur. Your tools are in a box by the loading dock. Don't come in. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the icy asphalt. Fired from the restaurant. Fired from the maintenance job. The $4,000 he had painstakingly saved was completely severed from a viable income stream. The $140,000 required to save his son's life evaporated into the freezing Chicago air. He was drowning. The sky had finally fallen, crushing the atlas of the South Loop into the concrete. He picked up the shattered phone. He had to get back to Thomas. The journey back to the apartment was a blur of frantic survival instinct. When Arthur turned the corner onto his street, the scene had escalated into a nightmare. The media presence had doubled. Camera crews, aggressive reporters holding microphones, and aggressive tabloid photographers swarmed the narrow sidewalk, completely blocking the entrance to his building. Arthur pulled his canvas jacket tight, lowering his head, and pushed into the crowd. "Mr. Brooks!" a voice screamed over the din. "Is it true you're extorting Claire Kensington? Are you sleeping with the CEO to pay your debts? Did you invent the story about your sick child to get her attention?" The flashbulbs were blinding, a relentless physical assault. Microphones were shoved into his face, bumping against his chin. He kept his mouth shut, using his broad shoulders like a snowplow, brutally forcing his way through the thrashing mass of bodies. He reached the heavy glass door of the building, fumbling for his keys. Suddenly, the door was yanked open from the inside. Robert stood there, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. "Arthur!" Robert screamed, grabbing him by the jacket and hauling him inside, slamming the heavy door shut against the flashing cameras. "It's Thomas! The noise, the yelling out here! He got terrified! He couldn't catch his breath! He collapsed!" The world stopped spinning. The ambient noise of the crowd outside vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, ringing silence in Arthur's ears. He sprinted up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. He burst into the apartment. Thomas was lying on the rug, his small body convulsing slightly. The oxygen cannula had torn free. His lips were a terrifying dark shade of purple. His chest was heaving with rapid, shallow, entirely ineffective gasps. It was a ventricular tachycardia episode. The failing heart was misfiring, sending the child into absolute shock. "Call 911!" Arthur roared, dropping to his knees, his hands frantically searching for a pulse at the boy's throat. It was there, but it was a rapid, chaotic flutter, like a dying bird trapped beneath the skin. He grabbed the emergency oxygen mask from the green tank, pressing it firmly over Thomas's mouth and nose, cranking the flow valve to maximum. "Breathe, Tommy," Arthur pleaded, tears finally breaking free, carving hot tracks down his face. "Breathe for me. The walls are strong. The walls are strong." 10 minutes later, the wail of ambulance sirens cut through the media circus outside. The paramedics breached the apartment, pushing Arthur aside with professional urgency. They stabilized the rhythm with a massive dose of intravenous amiodarone, strapped the tiny unconscious boy to a gurney, and hauled him down the stairs. Arthur rode in the back of the ambulance, gripping the metal rail of the gurney so hard his joints ached. He watched the paramedics bag his son, forcing oxygen into the failing lungs. The flashing red and blue lights painted the interior of the rig in the colors of an emergency that never ended. At Chicago General, the chaos of the emergency room swallowed them whole. Thomas was rushed through the swinging double doors of the pediatric intensive care unit. Arthur was left standing in the harsh fluorescent hallway, his clothes soaked in sweat, his hands stained with his own son's blood from a blown IV line. Time unspooled. It could have been hours or days. Arthur stood perfectly still against the cold cinder block wall, an empty shell of a man waiting for the final blow. The double doors opened. Dr. Evans walked out, his face drawn and gray. He was accompanied by a woman Arthur recognized vaguely. Margaret Vance, the hospital's chief administrator, a woman who cared exclusively about liability and public relations. "We stabilized the rhythm," Dr. Evans said quietly, refusing to meet Arthur's eyes. But the stress triggered a massive decompensation cascade. The valve is barely functioning. He requires full-time pure oxygen intubation. He cannot leave the ICU, Arthur. The 23-day window is gone. He needs the surgery now. Arthur exhaled a shuddering breath. "Dr. Thorne, you have the authorization from Claire Kensington. Do it." Margaret Vance stepped forward, her posture rigid, a clipboard pressed to her chest. She looked at Arthur with thinly veiled disgust, the tabloid headlines clearly etched into her perception of the man standing before her. "That is the problem, Mr. Brooks," the administrator said, her voice dripping with bureaucratic ice. "The media circus currently surrounding our emergency entrance is a severe disruption to hospital operations. The board of directors has convened an emergency review. In light of the highly public, scandalous nature of your relationship with Ms. Kensington, the hospital cannot accept a philanthropic transfer of funds from her personal accounts. It creates a massive conflict of interest and liability exposure." Arthur stared at her, his mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the corporate machine. "You are condemning a 6-year-old child to death over bad press?" "We are protecting the integrity of this institution," the administrator replied coldly. "The surgical block with Dr. Thorne remains on the schedule for Friday morning, but the deposit requirements stand. If you cannot produce $140,000 in clean, verifiable funds by Thursday evening, the board will pull the surgical block and reallocate the resources. I am sorry, Mr. Brooks." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. Dr. Evans lingered for a moment, a look of profound, helpless sorrow on his face. "I tried to fight them, Arthur. I'm sorry." He disappeared back into the ICU. Arthur Brooks was entirely alone in the sterile hallway. The jobs were gone. The money was gone. His reputation was utterly destroyed, burned to ash on the altar of the internet. The brilliant forensic weapon he had built for Claire was useless. She was likely fighting her own desperate battle for survival against the board, isolated and humiliated. And beyond the double doors, the broken metronome of his son's heart was slowing down. Arthur slowly slid down the cinder block wall, his knees hitting the cold floor. He buried his face in his large, calloused hands. The honorable everyman had played by the rules. He had fought with dignity. He had maintained his moral clarity, and he had lost everything. The dark night of the soul descended, absolute and suffocating, extinguishing the final desperate embers of hope in the freezing Chicago air. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of the pediatric intensive care unit was a terrible, suffocating metronome. Thursday morning, 2:14 a.m. The digital clock on the sterile white wall burned a harsh, crimson countdown into Arthur's retinas. 16 hours remained. At 6 o'clock that evening, the hospital administration would officially revoke the surgical block. The window for the mechanical valve replacement would slam shut permanently, sealing his son's fate in a tomb of bureaucratic protocol and bad press. Arthur stood entirely motionless before the massive pane of reinforced observation glass. Beyond the transparent barrier, Thomas lay suspended in a nightmare of medical architecture. The boy was completely intubated, a thick corrugated tube pushing pure pressurized oxygen directly into his failing lungs. The skin around his closed eyes was bruised a deep, translucent purple. The heart monitor traced a jagged, desperate green line, the failing mitral valve misfiring with terrifying frequency. The physical toll of the last 72 hours had stripped Arthur down to the absolute bedrock of his soul. His canvas work jacket hung heavily on his broad shoulders, stained with grease and the faint coppery shadow of his son's blood from the blown I-Fi line. The scandal, the flashing cameras, the loss of his livelihood, none of it registered in the freezing vacuum of the ICU corridor. There was only the green line on the monitor. A suffocating wave of claustrophobia seized him, tightening around his ribcage like iron bands. He needed to breathe air that didn't smell of iodine and impending death. He pushed away from the glass, his boots heavy on the polished linoleum. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Chicago General, descending through the silent subterranean levels until he reached the ambulance loading bay. The automatic doors parted, releasing him into the brutal, freezing teeth of the Chicago winter. The wind whipping off Lake Michigan carried sharp, microscopic shards of ice. Arthur walked to the edge of the concrete apron, letting the bitter cold shock his system, desperate for the physical pain to drown out the agonizing terror in his chest. A long, sleek silhouette detached itself from the shadows of the adjacent parking structure. The tires of the black Mercedes Maybach crunched softly over the salted ice, gliding to a halt directly beneath the harsh yellow glare of the sodium street lamp. The engine idled with a barely perceptible multi-cylinder purr. The rear passenger window lowered, the heavily tinted glass sliding down with the quiet whisper of expensive electric motors. Richard Vance sat in the cavernous, leather-lined interior. The architect of the corporate siege looked entirely immaculate. He wore a heavy, dark cashmere overcoat over a bespoke suit, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled despite the abysmal hour. The ambient yellow light caught the heavy gold rim of his chronograph wristwatch. He emanated an aura of absolute, untouchable privilege, a man accustomed to viewing human suffering as an abstract variable on a balance sheet. "Get in the car, Arthur," Vance instructed. The tone was not a request, it was the casual, arrogant command of a predator addressing its prey. Arthur did not move. He stood on the freezing concrete, his broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the ice. The air between them crackled with sudden, violent tension. "State your business, Vance." Arthur's voice was a deep, resonant rumble cutting through the howling wind. Vance sighed, a patronizing sound of feigned disappointment. He reached onto the plush leather seat beside him and picked up a slim, black leather portfolio. He unzipped it slowly, extracting a single rectangular slip of heavy paper. He extended his manicured hand through the open window, offering the document into the freezing air. "I am offering you salvation," Vance stated, a slick, terrible smile curving his lips. "Take it." Arthur stepped forward, closing the distance to the idling vehicle. He looked down at the paper pinched between Vance's fingers. It was a certified cashier's check, printed on thick, cream-colored security paper complete with holographic watermarks and the embossed seal of a major financial institution. The payee line bore Arthur's full legal name. The amount box was filled with stark, black, digitized numerals. $250,000. The number slammed into Arthur's chest with the kinetic force of a freight train. It was the exact price of a heartbeat multiplied. It was the surgical deposit, the post-operative care, the premium medications, and years of absolute, unshakable financial security. It was the immediate, miraculous end to the nightmare currently unfolding behind the glass on the 4th floor. "The funds are completely cleared, pre-certified, and ready for immediate deposit into the hospital's escrow account," Vance murmured, his voice dropping to a smooth, persuasive cadence. "Dr. Thorne scrubs in at dawn. The boy lives. The struggle ends tonight." Arthur stared at the zeros. The paper trembled slightly in the frigid wind. "What is the specific transaction?" "A brief, highly controlled interview on the national morning broadcast at 8 o'clock, Vance explained, leaning back into the luxurious shadows of the cabin. "A simple confirmation of the narrative currently circulating online. You sit before the cameras, you express your profound remorse. You state unequivocally that Claire Kensington utilized her extreme wealth to exploit your financial desperation. You confirm she is emotionally unstable, manipulative, and entirely unfit to wield executive authority over a publicly traded conglomerate. You validate the scandal, Arthur. The trap was utterly flawless. The tabloids had already built the scaffolding. Vance merely needed Arthur to kick the lever and drop the guillotine on Claire's career. The board would have irrefutable cause to terminate her leadership immediately. The logistics division would be liquidated. Vance would complete his hostile takeover, his massive internal theft forever buried under the ashes of Claire's public humiliation. Arthur reached out, his calloused, grease-stained fingers closing over the edge of the heavy security paper. He pulled the check from Vance's grip. The tactile sensation of the paper was agonizing. It felt incredibly heavy, saturated with the gravitational pull of his son's survival. The temptation clawed at the inside of his skull, a desperate, screaming instinct to surrender. The moral calculus was terrifyingly simple in the dark. If he accepted the money, Thomas would wake up. The terrible blue tint would vanish from the boy's lips. They could disappear, start over in a warm climate, far away from the brutal, freezing machinations of billionaires. All he had to do was look into a camera and destroy an innocent woman. All he had to do was feed Claire Kensington to the wolves. Arthur closed his eyes. The howling wind faded. He saw the corner alcove in the oak room. He saw Claire standing in his rundown apartment, shedding her impenetrable armor, looking at Thomas with genuine, terrified empathy. He remembered the blue manila folder she had handed him, the miraculous surgical authorization she had secured without demanding a single condition in return. He opened his eyes, looking down at the perfectly manicured hands resting on the leather armrest of the Maybach. Vance believed the entire world operated on a sliding scale of leverage. He believed poverty was a solvent that dissolved character, that desperation automatically equated to a complete lack of moral architecture. If Arthur cashed this check, he validated that toxic philosophy. He would purchase his son's future with stolen blood money, building a life on a foundation of absolute cowardice. How could he ever look Thomas in the eye? How could he teach the boy about the strength of Atlas, about holding the sky, knowing he had dropped the weight the moment the pain became unbearable? "You are hesitating, Arthur." Vance's voice sharpened, irritation bleeding through the slick veneer. "Do not be a fool. She is a billionaire. She will survive a bad news cycle and retire to a private island. Your son will not survive the weekend. The choice is biological imperative versus misplaced loyalty. Sign the endorsement." Arthur looked directly into Vance's eyes. The dark, bottomless intensity of the former risk analyst completely eclipsed the arrogant smirk of the corporate predator. The honorable everyman did not possess millions of dollars. He possessed an unyielding, unbreakable spine. Integrity is the only inheritance that cannot be taxed. Arthur's voice was a low, terrifying rumble of absolute finality. His large hands gripped the opposite edges of the heavy security paper. With a sharp, violent motion, he tore the check directly down the center. The sound of the tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet, freezing air. It was the sound of a bridge collapsing, of a safety net being severed. Vance lunged forward against his seatbelt, his eyes widening in absolute, uncomprehending shock. The smug certainty shattered, replaced by genuine, panicked fury. Arthur stacked the torn halves, gripped the thick edges, and tore them again. Quarters, eighths. He shredded the salvation of his universe into a handful of meaningless, jagged confetti. You cannot build a future on the foundation of a compromised soul. Arthur opened his fist, letting the freezing wind catch the torn fragments. My son will live with the pride that his father is a man of his word. I do not sell my humanity. The fragments fluttered like dirty snow, scattering across the abrasive, salted concrete of the ambulance bay. You arrogant, self-righteous bastard! Vance roared, his face flushing dark purple, the mask of civility completely obliterated. You just killed your own child. You killed him for nothing. Arthur did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood like an iron statue in the storm. "Your transaction is declined. Leave this property." Vance glared at him, pure, unadulterated venom burning in his eyes. He slammed his hand against the partition button. The tinted window shot upward, sealing the cabin. The Maybach's engine revved, the heavy tires spinning briefly on the ice before gripping the asphalt. The luxury vehicle accelerated violently out of the bay, its taillights bleeding into the dark Chicago night. Arthur stood alone in the howling wind. The adrenaline crash hit him immediately, a staggering wave of nausea and crushing, suffocating grief. He had done the right thing. He had maintained his moral clarity, and the price was the absolute total loss of hope. He looked down at his boots. The torn fragments of the cashier's check were scattered across the ice, shivering in the brutal wind. The harsh yellow glare of the sodium street lamp illuminated a jagged piece of the bottom edge, resting near the toe of his right boot. The magnetic ink character recognition line, the precise digitized routing sequence printed at the bottom of every legitimate bank draft. Arthur stared at the numbers. The crushing grief abruptly halted, replaced by a massive electric shock of pure cognitive recognition. The brilliant, hyper-vigilant analytical engine he had buried for 3 years suddenly fired with devastating precision. He possessed an eidetic memory for numerical sequences. He knew those numbers. 121000248. It was the exact 9-digit routing code he had traced on Claire's encrypted forensic ledger. The Bank of Western Nevada. It was the staging account, the primary nexus of the ghost architecture Vance was using to siphon the logistics capital out of Kensington Enterprises. The implications exploded in Arthur's mind, cascading through his analytical frameworks. Vance was too arrogant. He had not used his personal, untainted wealth to fund the bribe. He had drawn the cashier's check directly from the fraudulent corporate slush fund. The torn piece of paper lying on the ice was not just an extortion attempt. It was a direct, physical, irrefutable tether linking the hostile takeover, the massive internal theft, and the tabloid smear campaign. It was the smoking gun Claire needed to execute the corporate kill shot. Arthur dropped to his knees on the freezing, abrasive concrete. The cold soaked instantly through his canvas trousers, numbing his skin. But he did not feel it. He scrambled across the salted ice, his bare, calloused fingers scraping against the rough surface, frantically collecting every single torn fragment. He hunted the scraps of paper with the desperate intensity of a man gathering diamonds from a burning building. He found the piece containing Vance's authorized signature. He found the payee line. He found the complete routing sequence. He stuffed the jagged fragments deep into the inner pocket of his jacket, protecting them from the howling wind. He stood up, his knees bruised and bleeding slightly, his breath pluming in massive, ragged clouds. He looked up at the 4th-floor windows of the hospital. The battle was not over. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The execution was imminent. He had to deliver the weapon. Dawn broke over Lake Michigan like a bruised, violent wound, painting the heavy winter clouds in streaks of dark purple and cold, piercing orange. Arthur rode the elevated train back to the South Loop, his posture rigid, his dark eyes locked onto the passing skyline. The apartment was terrifyingly silent without the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the oxygen concentrator. The air was stale and freezing. Arthur did not turn on the lights. He walked directly into the cramped bedroom, moving with the precise, deliberate efficiency of a soldier preparing for a final assault. He opened the narrow closet. He pushed aside the faded flannel shirts and worn denim. At the very back, hanging beneath a heavy, opaque vinyl garment bag, was his past. He unzipped the bag. The zipper screamed in the quiet room. Inside hung a bespoke charcoal gray wool suit. It was tailored to perfection. A garment constructed for the sole purpose of projecting absolute, unassailable authority in the boardrooms of Wall Street. It was the armor of the senior risk analyst, untouched since the day he buried his wife. Arthur stripped off the grease-stained canvas jacket and the heavy work trousers. He stood in the freezing room, the cold raising goosebumps across his heavily muscled shoulders. He took a quick, punishingly cold shower, scrubbing the smell of the hospital and the maintenance basement from his skin. He shaved with meticulous, razor-sharp precision, removing the heavy stubble of his exhaustion. He dressed slowly. The crisp, heavily starched white dress shirt, the dark, conservative silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. He stepped into the charcoal trousers, the heavy wool falling perfectly over his legs. He shrugged on the suit jacket. The tailoring settled over his broad frame, instantly transforming the exhausted laborer into an apex predator of the financial sector. He sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled out a tin of wax. He worked the polish into the leather of his worn black Oxfords, buffing them with a soft cloth until they gleamed like dark, reflective mirrors. He walked to the kitchenette table. He retrieved the encrypted micro USB drive containing the raw hexadecimal outputs of Vance's shell companies. He took the torn fragments of the cashier's check and placed them carefully inside a clear plastic evidence slip he had taken from the ICU nurse's station. He slid the drive and the plastic slip into the inner breast pocket of the suit jacket. He felt the weight of the evidence resting directly over his heart. Arthur Brooks turned off the space heater, locked the apartment door, and walked out into the freezing morning. The honorable everyman was going to war. The Kensington building dominated the Chicago skyline, a towering obelisk of dark glass and brushed steel. At 8:45 a.m., the massive marble atrium was a fortress. The tabloid scandal had placed the entire corporate security apparatus on maximum alert. Uniformed guards monitored the revolving doors, scrutinizing identification badges with intense suspicion. Arthur did not approach the main reception desk. He knew the architectural layout of this building better than the security chief. He had spent 3 months overhauling the subterranean HVAC chillers 2 years prior. He walked around the corner to the loading dock access alley. He bypassed the delivery bays, slipping into a narrow, unmarked concrete stairwell designated for heavy maintenance. He encountered a heavy steel security door secured by a magnetic keypad lock. Arthur pulled a small, flat multi-tool from his pocket. He remembered the exact wiring schematic of this specific relay mechanism. He wedged the flathead edge under the plastic casing, exposing the colored wires. He bypassed the primary circuit, bridging the connection manually. The magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy, satisfying click in exactly 14 seconds. He slipped into the service corridor, walking with quiet, measured strides toward the heavy freight elevators. He bypassed the restricted access panel, overriding the system with a master maintenance sequence he had memorized. The massive metal doors parted. He stepped inside, pressing the button for the 50th floor. The elevator ascended, a smooth, silent launch into the stratosphere of corporate power. The doors opened onto the executive suite. The sensory shift was absolute. The air was climate-controlled perfection, smelling faintly of expensive floral arrangements and ozone. The thick, plush carpeting absorbed the sound of frantic activity. Administrative assistants hurried between desks, their faces pale, the atmosphere thick with the desperate, suffocating panic of an empire collapsing. Arthur stepped out of the freight elevator. A young executive assistant looked up, her eyes widening in shock. She recognized his face from the screaming red headlines of the digital tabloids. But the man walking toward her was not a ragged, manipulative grifter. He was a towering, impeccably dressed titan, moving with the terrifying, unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave. He did not stop. He did not ask for directions. He walked directly toward the massive double mahogany doors of the primary boardroom at the end of the hall. Inside the cavernous room, the execution was entering its final phase. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping, dizzying view of Lake Michigan, glittering under the hard morning sun. The massive oval mahogany table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by 14 members of the board of directors. Claire Kensington stood at the head of the table. She wore a stark, blindingly white suit, a deliberate, defiant contrast to the dark suits surrounding her. But the Ice Queen armor was cracking. She looked incredibly pale, shadows bruising the skin under her eyes. The massive projector screen behind her displayed the high-resolution tabloid photographs, the intimate moment in the restaurant, the desperate exchange in the slum hallway. Richard Vance stood near the center of the long table, delivering the lethal blow. "The optics are catastrophic, gentlemen," Vance declared, his voice smooth, resonant, dripping with feigned sorrow. "We are witnessing the profound psychological deterioration of our chief executive. The erratic behavior, the severe lack of judgment, the susceptibility to blatant emotional manipulation by a severely compromised individual. The market is already reacting. The stock is hemorrhaging. We cannot allow personal instability to destroy the fiduciary foundation of this conglomerate. The logistics liquidation is no longer a strategic option. It is an absolute necessity to stabilize our capital reserves. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence." The board members, older men with silver hair and ruthless instincts, nodded in solemn agreement. The narrative was perfect. The trap was closed. Arthur reached the heavy mahogany doors. He placed his large hands flat against the polished wood and pushed. The doors swung inward with a loud, authoritative crack, slamming against the padded walls. The sound echoed through the boardroom like a gunshot, slicing instantly through Vance's monologue. Every head snapped toward the entrance. Arthur Brooks stepped across the threshold. The shock in the room was absolute, a physical vacuum pulling the air from the executive's lungs. They recognized him immediately, the grifter, the tabloid villain, but the sheer, imposing reality of the man completely shattered their preconceived narrative. He stood 6'2", the bespoke charcoal suit draped flawlessly across his athletic frame, his dark eyes burning with cold, analytical fire. He did not look like a man seeking a handout. He looked like an executioner arriving to collect a debt. Vance's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. "Security!" Vance roared, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. "Breach on the 50th floor. Remove this trespasser immediately." Arthur ignored him completely. He walked the length of the massive room, his polished Oxfords silent on the thick carpet. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, commanding the absolute attention of every billionaire in the room. He reached the center of the mahogany table, stopping directly opposite Richard Vance. Arthur reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He extracted the clear plastic evidence slip. He opened the flap, upending the contents directly onto the highly polished wood. The jagged, torn fragments of the cashier's check scattered across the table, the black ink stark against the dark mahogany. A lie travels the globe while the truth is still lacing its boots, but the truth always arrives. Arthur's voice filled the cavernous room. It was a deep, resonant baritone vibrating with the terrifying, unassailable weight of absolute moral clarity. You believed a fabricated scandal because it was wrapped in comfortable prejudice. Here is the absolute truth wrapped in felony theft. He reached into his pocket again and placed the encrypted USB drive beside the torn paper. What is this absurdity? The silver-haired board member demanded, glaring at the torn fragments. Security is on the way, Mr. Brooks. You have severely overplayed your hand. Arthur did not look at the board member. He locked his dark, intense gaze entirely on Richard Vance. The predator was beginning to sweat, a fine sheen of moisture appearing on his forehead. That is a certified cashier's check in the amount of $250,000, Arthur stated, his voice ringing with crystalline precision. Presented to me at 2:30 this morning by Mr. Vance, in the ambulance bay of Chicago General Hospital. It was a bribe. The condition of the transaction required me to publicly corroborate the false tabloid narrative he engineered to humiliate your chief executive. A murmur of shock rippled through the seated executives. Vance slammed his hands down on the table. "This is slander!" Vance shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "He is an extortionist. He tore up a piece of blank paper for a theatrical stunt." Arthur calmly reached forward, He used a single calloused finger to slide 3 specific fragments of the torn check together, aligning the bottom edge perfectly. "Examine the magnetic ink character recognition line," Arthur instructed, his tone shifting into the cold, authoritative cadence of the senior risk analyst. "The 9-digit routing sequence is 121-000-248, the Bank of Western Nevada." He gestured to the USB drive. "I urge the board to access the forensic ledger contained on that drive. It contains the raw hexadecimal outputs mapping the flow of capital from the logistics division." Mr. Vance did not use his personal wealth to finance this bribe. He used the corporate slush fund he created by artificially inflating the fleet depreciation metrics. The Nevada proxy servers funneled the stolen capital directly into a Delaware blind trust managed by his personal attorney, Marcus Sterling. The boardroom was paralyzed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The implications hit the executives like a series of physical blows. "The check on this table is a direct physical draw from the stolen logistics capital," Arthur concluded, stepping back, leaving the evidence resting in the center of the mahogany expanse. "Mr. Vance engineered a hostile takeover by embezzling corporate funds and then attempted to use those identical stolen funds to purchase a witness to destroy Ms. Kensington. The hostile bid is a smokescreen for federal fraud." The silver-haired board member, a man who possessed a ruthless instinct for self-preservation, snatched the USB drive from the table. He plugged it directly into his secure terminal. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the encryption with the password Arthur had included in the root file. The massive spreadsheet populated on his screen. The board member's eyes darted across the data, cross-referencing the routing numbers, tracking the flow of the phantom debt. His face drained of all color. Turning a sickly ashen gray, he looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto Richard Vance. "The routing numbers are a perfect match," the board member whispered, the horror absolute in his voice. "The depreciation schedules are entirely fabricated. Millions are missing." The realization detonated in the room. The arrogance of the billionaires evaporated instantly, replaced by the chaotic, desperate panic of men realizing they had almost voted to endorse a massive federal crime. The liability exposure was catastrophic. Vance stepped back from the table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The immaculate facade completely collapsed. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors. "This is manipulated data," Vance stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "He is a hacker. He fabricated the ledger to protect her." The double doors swung open again. The private corporate security team poured into the room, their faces grim, their hands resting on their tactical belts. They did not approach Arthur Brooks. The silver-haired board member pointed a trembling finger at the architect of the siege. "Detain Mr. Vance. Immediately. Confiscate his corporate communication devices. Someone get the SEC compliance director on the line right now. We need federal authorities in this building." 2 massive security guards flanked Richard Vance, grabbing his arms with brutal professional efficiency. The corporate predator struggled briefly, a pathetic, humiliating display before they dragged him toward the service elevators. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Board members shouted into their cell phones, scrambling to mitigate the explosive fallout, desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius of Vance's destruction. Within 3 minutes, the executives fled the boardroom, retreating to their private offices to summon their legal teams. The massive double doors swung shut, sealing the room. The silence rushed back in, profound and ringing. Arthur stood near the edge of the mahogany table. The adrenaline spike had crested, leaving a deep, trembling exhaustion settling into his bones. His breath hitched slightly in his chest. He looked down at his polished shoes. He had won the war, but he did not know if the victory had arrived in time to save the heartbeat. He heard a soft, shuddering breath behind him. He turned. Claire Kensington remained at the head of the table. The Ice Queen armor was completely, utterly annihilated. She looked incredibly small, standing alone in the cavernous architecture of her empire. Her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The severe, controlled expression was gone. Tears held back behind the fortress walls for a decade of absolute ruthless control finally spilled over her pale eyelashes. They tracked silently down her cheeks, ruining her perfect makeup. Arthur walked slowly down the length of the table, closing the vast, impossible distance between their universes. He stopped a few feet away from her. Claire looked up at him, her pale blue eyes swimming with a vulnerability so profound it was almost difficult to witness. "I thought you took the money," Claire whispered, her voice cracking, a fragile, broken sound. "When they showed me the tabloid pictures, when I realized how perfectly he had framed you, I thought you took the money. I thought I was completely alone again. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who only look at me to calculate what they can extract from the vault. I am so used to being used." Arthur felt a deep, fierce ache in his chest. He saw the lady trapped in the ice, shivering in the cold. He stepped closer, his broad frame casting a warm, protective shadow over her. "You cannot purchase loyalty and you cannot sell truth," Arthur said, his deep baritone providing a steady, immovable anchor in the quiet room. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently resting on the polished wood beside hers. "You deserve to be respected, Claire, not for your title, not for your capital, for your humanity." Claire's breath hitched violently in her throat. The tears flowed freely now, washing away the last remnants of the frozen CEO. She looked at the tall, impeccably dressed man, the father who had marched into hell and burned it down rather than compromise his soul. "Say it again," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with absolute desperation, needing the words to anchor her to the earth. Arthur did not break eye contact. The moral clarity radiating from him was absolute, warm, and entirely genuine. "You deserve to be respected." The heavy, multi-line phone resting in the center of the conference table suddenly emitted a sharp, buzzing tone. The flashing red light indicated a priority override from the executive reception desk. Claire wiped her face rapidly, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady herself. She reached out and pressed the speaker button. "Miss Kensington," the administrative assistant's voice echoed through the room, frantic but carrying a note of immense relief. "I apologize for the interruption, but the chief administrator from Chicago General Hospital is on the secure line. She states it is an absolute emergency regarding Mr. Brooks." Arthur's heart stopped. The air vanished from his lungs. "Put her through," Claire commanded, her voice instantly regaining a fraction of its steel. A sharp click resounded, followed by the cold, bureaucratic voice of Margaret Vance, the hospital administrator. The arrogant edge was completely gone, replaced by careful, deferential panic. "Ms. Kensington, Mr. Brooks, I am calling to confirm the immediate receipt of a wire transfer from the Kensington Philanthropic Trust in the amount of $140,000. The funds have cleared the escrow hold." The administrator paused, swallowing audibly over the speaker. "The surgical block has been reinstated. Dr. Thorne has scrubbed in. The boy is currently in the operating theater. The procedure has begun." Arthur closed his eyes. A single heavy tear escaped, tracking down his dark cheek. The terrible weight of the sky finally shifted from his shoulders, transferring to the capable hands of the surgeon. The countdown clock in his skull stopped ticking at hour 0. He opened his eyes. Claire was looking at him, a beautiful, genuine, watery smile breaking across her face. The storm was over. 18 months later, the brutal Chicago winter was a distant, fading memory. The sprawling green lawns of Grant Park were bathed in the heavy, golden warmth of a Saturday afternoon in late July. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, blooming lilacs, and the faint, sweet scent of roasted almonds from a nearby vendor. The sound of children laughing and the distant splash of Buckingham Fountain carried perfectly on the gentle breeze rolling off Lake Michigan. Arthur sat on a large, red-checkered picnic blanket spread beneath the sweeping shade of a massive oak tree. The heavy charcoal suit was gone, replaced by a crisp, high-quality white linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the thick, corded muscle of his forearms. The lines of exhausted terror that had once bracketed his dark eyes were completely erased, smoothed away by months of deep, quiet peace. He was no longer a maintenance worker, nor a ghost in the financial system. He was the newly appointed Director of Corporate Risk Analysis for Kensington Enterprises, operating with absolute autonomy directly beneath the CEO. Arthur watched the vast expanse of the green lawn. Thomas was running. The 7-year-old boy was sprinting across the grass, chasing the erratic, diving tail of a brightly colored kite. There was no heavy green tank. There were no plastic tubes trailing from his face. The terrible, suffocating blue tint was gone forever, replaced by the flushed, vibrant, oxygen-rich glow of a healthy, fiercely energetic child. He ran with wild, boundless freedom, his laughter ringing out clear and strong. Beneath his small t-shirt, a faint vertical scar traced the center of his chest, the only remaining physical evidence of the desperate, agonizing war they had fought and won. Claire sat beside Arthur on the blanket. The armored slate-gray suits and severe hairstyles were banished to the corporate week. She wore a simple, elegant yellow sundress, her bare feet resting comfortably in the warm grass. The isolated, frozen posture of the Ice Queen had entirely melted. She leaned back on her hands, her face tilted up toward the sun, laughing brightly at Thomas's frantic attempts to keep the kite airborne. It was a warm, uninhibited sound that resonated with profound, earned happiness. The tabloid scandal was a forgotten footnote. Richard Vance was serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. The company had stabilized, thriving under Claire's renewed empathetic leadership, guided by Arthur's flawless analytical defense grids. The kite finally caught a heavy downdraft, spiraling into the grass. Thomas scooped it up and ran back toward the oak tree, his chest heaving with healthy, vibrant exertion. He dropped onto the blanket, a wide, gap-toothed smile spreading across his face. He reached into his small canvas backpack and pulled out a heavy piece of drawing paper, handing it proudly to Arthur. Arthur took the paper, holding it up so Claire could see. It was a riot of brilliant, joyful crayon colors. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood in the center, holding a small boy high upon his shoulders. The sky above them was bright, clear blue, completely devoid of storms or shadows. And standing right next to them, her hand firmly holding the man's free hand, was a woman in a bright yellow dress. The drawing was simple, crude, and absolutely perfect. Claire looked at the crayon rendering. The lady in the ice was gone. The woman on the paper had a massive, radiant smile drawn across her face. Arthur looked at Claire, his dark eyes filled with the quiet, profound strength of a man who had refused to surrender his dignity and had won the entire world in return. He reached out, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, gripping her hand tightly in the warm summer sun. The honorable everyman had held the sky long enough for the light to finally break through.